Great. Thanks, Kelly. And thanks for everybody for joining us today. I look forward to an exciting discussion about data mapping, data inventory, and how to make sure that your data supports a wide variety of compliance and other initiatives that are out there. In terms of housekeeping, before we get started, we are recording today's session, and so this will be available for you afterwards. You don't need to take notes furiously. We will do Q&A at the end, but feel free to submit them throughout the process, and we'll try to sprinkle them in if we can. But we do have some time allocated at the end to go ahead and do that. And then to the extent that we can't, we'll go ahead and try to answer them after the fact if possible. We do have some attorneys on the phone and on the presentation today, so we want to have this disclaimer. We're not attempting to render legal, data privacy or other specific advice. So we'll be talking, thematically about best practices, but you should certainly consult a legal professional if you're curious about, particular impacts of a given statute or regulation. And finally, Kelly alluded to us here at the beginning. So I'll start, and then we'll talk in a little bit of detail about our other panelists. But as she said, I'm Dean Gonzalski. I'm the CRO at ActiveNav. I actually am an attorney by training, but I haven't practiced in ages. I do a lot of work around e-discovery and information governance. And from my perspective today and throughout the discussion will be on the technological end. Active Navigation, our former name, now ActiveNav, we help provide both data mapping and then remediation software. So we help you find your data, assess it, and we'll talk about how that works, and then to the extent that it needs to be quarantined or deleted or migrated, our software does that as well. And so that'll be my perspective, and I'm really pleased to be joined by a great panel here today. Jason, why don't you kick off, talk a little bit more in depth about your practice area and your perspective on today's session.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dean. So I am an attorney at Shepherd Mullen, a full-service law firm in their San Diego office. We offer, basically a full suite of data privacy, cybersecurity, incident response, vendor management, and pretty much anything you can imagine when it comes to the cybersecurity and data privacy side of the law. I focus predominantly on incident response as well as vendor management and project management from, kind of from soup to nuts when it comes to establishing a privacy compliance program, as well as advising on all, California as well as EU GDPR legal risks in this space. So with that, I will hand it over to Brian, and he can do a little bit of an intro himself.
Thanks, Jason. I appreciate it, and thank you for everyone for your time to join us today, and to the ActiveNav team for hosting us. So my name is Brian Segoviano. I'm a certified information privacy professional and a managing director in Ankura's technology, privacy, and cyber risk advisory business. If you're not familiar with Ankura, we're a global consulting firm, about 1,500 employees worldwide in 40 plus cities throughout the US, as well as in the EU, with our primary operations in London and through Asia Pacific and in Hong Kong and Australia and other parts throughout the globe. And within Ankura, our cyber and privacy practice works both proactively and reactively. On the proactive side, where Joe and I focus most of our time, work on privacy and cyber compliance, risk assessments, vendor risk management. We have an ongoing monitoring service. It's a Gartner-rated managed detection and response business that monitors firewall and network traffic, and then also have extensive experience and offer the 24/7 boots on the ground for incident response and forensic capabilities, which are on all the major insurance panels. Again, my personal focus is on implementing programs and operationalizing compliance with GDPR, CCPA, HIPAA, other related data protection laws and frameworks. I've spent a lot of my time doing data mapping, also have a background in e-discovery like Dean and others on the call. So I think a lot of us that have been doing that in a reactive sense have gotten onto the proactive side here as well. So what I look forward to bringing is that experience and how to build a data inventory that's not just a one size, but it's something that can work for lots of parts of the organization and not create different risk stovepipes, and can be leveraged for a long time. So with that, I appreciate it, and I will turn it over to Joe Shepley.
Thanks, Brian. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining today. Joe Shepley, I'm a managing director along with Brian in the privacy practice at Ankura. I'm also a certified information privacy professional for US, but honestly, I've been messing around with the wider world of information risk, information governance for about 20 years now. came to privacy in the last few years. As it's picked up, we'll hear a bit more about the timeline there and how the increasing importance of privacy. But my approach really has been more from a traditional information governance, records and information management. How do folks manage the risk and the value associated with their information, structured and unstructured? And so excited here to, and I've worked a lot maybe over the last 8 or 9 years with machine-assisted governance. So how to use file analytics tools like ActiveNav and others to help you get your hands around your content. And so excited to talk about that perspective on coming together to put together data maps.
Great. Well, thanks, Joe. Let's talk about our agenda today. We've got we don't have a huge amount of slides. We've got some nice workflows and some other things we'll talk about, and certainly want to be responsive to your questions. But generally, we're gonna set the scene and talk about data proliferation, which is common to everyone. And I think probably, if we talk about our exact moment in time right now, we know that with remote workers and shadow IT, data proliferation is even more difficult for organizations to manage as people are working remote, certainly for the time being and maybe well into the future. And then, we're going to talk about the core substance today about data inventory and data mapping, understanding your data universe and what that means and how does that imply a better understanding of the regulatory regimes that are out there. And some require specifically you to do certain things, and other ones just imply the existence of a data inventory. And then we want this to be practical, and so we'll talk about where to start and best practices and a few other things as we go. So I think in the day I was thinking about big data as we were kind of preparing for this presentation. And big data seemed to be a thing 5 or 10 years ago. When bigger was better. And volume, velocity, variety, right? The 3 V's of big data are continuing in spades. And big data is not quite as good a thing as it used to be. It certainly can be important if you're leveraging it for the right business purpose. But the dangers of data, if we go on to our next slide, are certainly apparent, right? The actually almost looks like a dumpster fire there. Hashtag 2020. But needless to say, data is one of those things, 5 or 10 years ago where we thought, let's just collect it all and we'll eventually figure out how it will help us organizationally, either for disaster recovery, business continuity, or analytics. It was just more data is better. And I think with the changing regulatory climate, we're seeing that more data isn't necessarily better, and you're more likely to be injured in the fire than you will be, harnessing it.
Dean, the other thing too is this. I mean, over 20 years, it's like, oh man, storage. You got to really save storage, and it's like it got so cheap that was a really easy way to get lazy. It was like your house is a mess. Just move to a bigger house, no problem, right? And I have way less stuff now. Well, the problem is that the cost of the storage isn't the problem, right? Just like you said, it's a lot of the risk side. But so for years, it's been a struggle because everyone just says, well, storage is pennies, right? Who cares? Well, now we care, right?
Yeah, and Joe, I think about that as well, where, again, as everyone grew up in this, IT, last 2 decades, it was, I need to make sure I've got the one copy of my PowerPoint in 17 places because God forbid if something blows up, I need to have access to it. And now we're at the point where like, no, we're not really losing data. We're using the cloud anyway. Do I need 17 versions of it? No, I just need the version. And also, what's the worst case scenario if you couldn't find that PowerPoint? You probably had 19 versions of the 17 versions. So I think we're entering an era of the data minimization sort of time frame that we're in now. We'll talk about that with the regulations. It's, keep what you need. Don't just keep stuff to keep stuff. And to your point about laziness. So as we move on, the key will be, in the abstract, we didn't just change overnight about how we think about being lazy and bad information governance hygiene. In reality, it's been this groundswell and started with GDPR. And Jason, I know this is where you live day to day and all these various regulations. But maybe you could walk through some of the notable ones here, and then I think it's interesting. The 2021's kind of upon us, and there's a few blanks there.
Yeah, absolutely. This year has been quite the, not just in data privacy, but a lot of things have changed this year, data privacy being one of them. This slide is already a little bit passe, as CPRA in California passed during the November election, but I'll take a step back and kind of show you how we got here. So even before the GDPR, there was what was called the DPD, the Data Protection Directive in the EU. But GDPR was really a watershed moment where the European Union said, okay, no more, data privacy is important, and we are willing to throw down the gauntlet and start going after companies and entities that are not abiding by the rules. GDPR has really become sort of the model for international data privacy laws. The Brazil Privacy Act, also called the LGPD. I won't try my Portuguese to explain what that is, but it's basically GDPR translated into Portuguese. Actually came into effect in August of this year. It won't be enforced or September of this year. It won't be enforced for a year, but things are moving quickly. Additionally, the e-privacy regulation is a complementary regulation to the general data protection regulation in the EU. While it's still in draft form, it basically will clear up when eventually it is published. It was supposed to be rolled out at the same time as GDPR. It will clear up some ambiguities when it comes to cookies. I'm sure you've all been seeing these wonderful cookie banners all across California and the world. This is why the e-privacy regulation is supposed to step in, fill that gap, and finally give us some clear guidance as to how to deal with cookies. Finally, the Swiss Data Protection Act and also complemented GDPR. As we all know, Switzerland kind of likes to fly solo, even though it's nestled directly in the heart of Europe. But they're starting to come into line with the GDPR. And then finally, the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, came into force into January of this year and has already been amended, as I mentioned, by the CPRA. What's interesting about the California Consumer Privacy Act is that it really moves California closer to the European model and the worldwide model. So historically, the United States has taken a very sectoral approach towards privacy. So you can think of laws like HIPAA and GLBA, where it is about the data type and not the individual. California has now had a paradigm shift where we're focusing on the individual as a consumer or as a data subject, as it's referred to in Europe. With that, the CPRA, which has now passed and comes into force on January 1st, 2023, even expands the rights and brings the CCPA closer into line with GDPR. So specifically, CCPA mentions data retention, having data retention schedules, gets at this idea of data minimization, which is very crucial to GDPR, data proportionality. And so what all this means is there are common threads across the international laws, but there are also differences and balkanization of international laws. So what this really means is that you can't let the law drive your data compliance and your data mapping and your data inventory program. You have to have the data inventory program first and then figure out how to deal with and comply with the different laws across the world. It's very much, you can kind of think of it like a blood test, right? A doctor can't diagnose you with what you have until he knows, until he can see what you're collecting and what you have, what sort of illness you are dealing with. Very much here, you don't want to put the cart before the horse. You want to know what you have first, and then once you know that, you can start complying with different laws.
Yeah, Jason, what about the folks who are waiting for sort of a federal standard and that cavalry to come, anytime soon?
So great question. There have been some discussions in the House of Representatives in committee regarding building out a federal privacy law. Unfortunately, I would not expect anything quite yet. I'm hopeful that we'll see something in the next 5 years, but I don't think we're quite there yet. But that being said, we are seeing a lot of movement at the state level. I would expect this January to see Washington State roll out a CCPA-like law and finally get that put into place. They have almost completed that twice. There were basically some legislative hurdles in 2020 and 2019 that impeded that progress. But this is not just going to be a California issue. This is going to be a U.S. nationwide, state-by-state program until we get federal preemption, hopefully sooner rather than later. But I would say for the time being, buckle up and be ready to comply with different state regimes.
Yeah, and it's probably illustrative of that even in California, we've already seen sort of a law and then a new law on top of it. So in 5 years, I can only imagine what the tapestry of all the states' regulations will look like.
Yeah, and if I could jump in there one side, I know we've got a global group on the line here today, but for those that have been following the U.S., there's kind of been right now 2 major proposals from different sides of the aisle on that federal privacy regulation. And preemption aside, which is the big conversation, one thing that we're seeing at the federal level at all the U.S. states that is aligning it's more in the U.S. with the European approach is privacy impact assessments. So like data protection impact assessments under the GDPR and Article 35, the concept of doing more proactively, moving towards a privacy by design approach to having an impact assessment prior to processes going online is a common thread, and I think something that's going to be a big shift. Similarly, another common thread is the transparency requirements. So having to, like CCPA, having to disclose the elements of information collected, how it was shared with, obviously, consumer rights, as we call them here, like data subject rights in the EU, are all common threads that we're seeing come over here. One thing that also has come out for, again, those building programs that have a U.S. flavor is NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, has they drafted and now produced their 1.0 version of their privacy framework, which we see a lot of organizations using as a starting point to build governance around a program in advance of a federal law, but one that can also start to align U.S. states, federal, maybe sectoral requirements, your more global European requirements. We see that as a good way to start to harmonize a lot of those obligations.
Yeah, needless to say, we could spend the hour quite easily talking about all the various privacy regimes that are out there, but we want to jump into practically, how do you start operationalizing them and addressing the risk for your organization, right? It's certainly no good to be aware of the regulations and not start taking proactive steps. And with enforcement, and I think with the CPRA is interesting that they created an enforcement mechanism that the CCPA didn't have, and so I think you're going to see enforcement start to happen sooner than later with a lot of these regulations. So let's walk through. We won't walk through all the general terms, but when we mentioned we talked a little bit about data inventory. How do you guys think about the difference between a data map and a data inventory? I know I use them interchangeably and probably incorrectly, but why don't you guys set me straight on how I should be using them?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And these terms on here, not necessarily that we are from regulations, but just from experience doing hundreds of these types of engagements and seeing the same thing that was just mentioned. When we say a data inventory to one individual, it means something different to another. So I think the most important ones to delineate between on here is, again, just terms of art that we've started to use as a data inventory compared to a data map, right? Sounds similar, but the way we think of an inventory is truly that. It's a list of, might be processes like, social media marketing, employee onboarding, recruiting, that collect, store, create, use information to achieve some business purpose, or it's assets that would be some type of system that is actually storing the information for use. So the inventory really is, almost more, if you think of it like a spreadsheet, right? It's the list of all of those. And then some contextual information around that, like why are we collecting it? Who do we share it with? The data map is often thought of, and I know Joe will talk about this a lot today as well, is that bottom-up approach where we apply potentially some type of data scanning to automatically discover what specific elements there are. We start to trace lineage from source system to storage system to onward transfer party or system, and get more of that flow, more of that granular visibility. Now, both of those I think are really important for an organization because that former has the context that you need to comply with Article 30 as an example, and why do we collect this? What's our legal basis? that type of information that we have to disclose, or what are the categories of processors we have for a CCPA notice. But that scanning and that bottom up and that map is how we really start to introduce controls and governance around the process. So hopefully that, I know some of those terms of art will be used throughout this discussion. Hopefully that starts to set a good baseline for us.
Yeah, Brian, and I hear a lot of times you talk to customers about data map, and they'll say, well, we've got a data map, and I'll say, well, how did you generate it? And they'll say, well, we had a bunch of custodian interviews. So, and I'd say, well, okay, I assume that the custodians, A, that sounds painful. B, it sounds like the custodians must really know their data. It's clearly an interesting part of the process. Where do you see that contrasted with or supplementing a technological sort of scanning approach as well? How do you think about the interplay between the two?
Yeah, I think it depends on your level of maturity with it. And I think those custodian interviews, agree, absolutely, that's not the evergreen solution, right? And we'll show that kind of in a target operating model here. Most organizations, the first time you ask them to do this, say, we don't even know really which assets are what's being used for a specific purpose, or if we're just dumping everything into box. So what we see those custodian interviews valuable for is discovery, right? Like getting all the cards on the table and being able to start to prioritize and risk rank where we need to dive a bit deeper. But certainly then, long term, when we think about governance and controls and being able to justify the types of things that we disclose in a privacy notice, that's where scanning, really getting and maintaining what we would consider a map become important. So I think that those, again, the short on is it's helpful for discovery. You need some context out of that on which third parties we have, why do we share it, so we can write good notices. But the long-term, mature solution will require more technology.
Okay, well, let's keep moving. We've got some of the foundation in, and this is just a good quote about data mapping and how do you govern what you don't understand is probably the fundamental challenge for most organizations. They tend to want to jump into we call it first mile, last mile. They want to jump into the last mile. Maybe it's a DSAR or some other sort of end result of the process, but foundationally the data mapping and inventory piece has to be one of the first steps, and we'll go into the workflow and a little bit through the discussion. And I think we can jump into here. I mean, there's a lot going on here. How do you guys think about how do you orchestrate both the use cases and all the stakeholders who care about this data inventory and these other processes we've talked about?
Yeah, and I think what we've hit on a lot of this, right? Like bare minimum, a lot of organizations do inventory because we want to comply with Article 30 of the GDPR. And actually, even in the U.S., getting back to the sectoral laws under HIPAA, the OCR has recently issued guidance that if you're going to meet the standard for doing HIPAA risk assessments, you really need to have a data inventory if you're going to do that accurately. So, at minimum, those are needed for compliance. But again, making sure our privacy notices are reasonably correct, make that are we completely violating our records retention schedules that we have? For legal discovery, do we have data stores that may be responsive or holding information that are going to subject us to a spoliation claim are other really important areas. And then obviously from more of a technical side, making sure that IT has visibility. There's we're discovering what shadow systems are out there, and we're putting the right protection and breach protocols around those. Obviously, a number of reasons beyond just baseline compliance for these.
Yeah, and I think, Brian, too, it's funny. We're talking about a lot of the risk stuff. Well, one thing, all the reasons you mentioned, what I've noticed a lot at clients is that they'll do it for all those reasons, and they'll do it one time for each of those reasons. Like you've got 2, 3, 4 groups all working on this because one's concerned with the cyber risk, one's concerned with privacy, one's concerned with records management, and so on. And they have no idea that they're all doing it, and they only find out because the end users go, hey, dummy, this is like the 5th survey I've answered about the same questions. And they go, gosh, I had no idea what was happening. But I think in addition to that, too, this is very much the risk side of it. There's the value side, which is, what's the value to the business of being able to find the documents that they need? Just a simple industry example is you look at anybody who's in heavy industry who operates a refinery, an oil well, a manufacturing plant. They do preventative and corrective maintenance all the time where they get a work order and it says, find this functional location and do these things to it. And I mean, if they can't get the drawings that they need that are current, they'll get the wrong tools, they'll get the wrong parts, or heaven forbid, they turn the wrong knob and we have loss of life, we have an incident. And so we're all very much compliance professionals, but there's follow-on knock-on benefits for the business to have, to know where stuff is and to be able to leverage it better as well. So I think that's important too, to remember there's a positive side to it, not just a slap on the wrist side.
Yeah, Joe, on the first part of your commentary there about numerous initiatives, we've talked to lots of companies who are doing that, literally simultaneously siloed initiatives to data map. And one of my questions is, what do you then do with 5 data maps? And how do you decide which is the right one, the current one, the best one? You're almost in a worse position because now you've got conflicting views of reality, because God knows they're not going to all align with each other. And so to me, it's I'd rather have a single source of truth that maybe is imperfect than 5 different versions of reality. If you encounter that, and is there a way to try to wrangle all those views of the world together?
The best is when you encounter it, or like when they discover it early on, and you can go, gosh, we've got 5 questionnaires that are 10 questions each. Instead of having 50 questions, we actually can probably, for vendor risk, for cyber, for records, right, for privacy, we probably need a couple of different questions for each one. And so it's really a great benefit for the end users because they can, it's a much more streamlined way. But once they've been built, I mean, like Brian said, they're kind of obsolete as soon as you finish. It's a living document. And so if they've approached it as a once and for all, and we check back in every couple of years, even if they only have one, it's probably not accurate. So, it's really working, as Brian will talk about in the target operating model, to help them understand this isn't just do it once and thank goodness we can forget about it. This will be a continual discipline that requires a program to be constantly tending to it, right? You can have a landscape architect come in and make your yard look nice, and you can sit up with your feet up for maybe 2 weeks, and then it starts to look like crap again. And that's kind of what it is. It's like, are you going to tend to your garden week over week, as an organization? And if you are, then, this is kind of what you signed up for. So,
well, I just checked the attendee question panes. We've got a couple. I'll hit one here. And this is from Gareth. I won't give all of his particulars away. But the question is, does this global approach really work? Enterprises struggle to understand national legislation and regulations, let alone global. So I guess, yes, it's a challenge, but don't you have to build to some level, either the high water mark, the median mark, the low mark? You have to kind of build something versus playing whack-a-mole with each individual regulation that comes down the pike. What do you guys think about that question?
Yeah, I'd love to chime in on that. I think it has to be an integrated approach, right? You operate in different jurisdictions, you operate in different locales around the world. You kind of look for common threads, like I was talking about earlier, and you say, okay, these issues are common across the globe, and let's start here. Let's do what we need to comply with these minimum requirements, and then you start tailoring for each jurisdiction that has bespoke legal rules that are different from one another. But there are commonalities here, and just knowing your data I cannot emphasize how important that is. You have Article 17, right to be forgotten, right to erasure in Europe. That's mirrored by California Civil Code Section 1798-105B, which is basically, you can delete somebody, and if you don't know where their data is, you can't adequately delete them. So that's how I would say you should approach it, is be holistic. I always say with my clients, we need to be thoughtful about this. We don't want to just start running and hitting things. We want to kind of pre-plan. If anybody's ever done any coding, it's kind of like writing pseudocode. Before you have the program ready to run, you want the pseudocode so you know how it's going to run, what the plan is, and what the high level mission statement is. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, as a former programmer, I appreciate the pseudocode reference for sure. I agree. I think kind of taking it from the lens of what was said earlier about the frameworks. Having worked with a lot of clients, that are very global. First, I think that culture is different and resources are different everywhere. If you are an organization that So then I think the question, how those frameworks, can we, do they really work if we try to harmonize everything? If you're an organization that has had, that is global, but you have a small centralized privacy, office that everything gets put on and you're responsible for the governance through the organization, then I think you have to go there. I think you have to find a framework like a NIST or an ISO 27701, and then map all of your obligations on there. Knowing that admittedly, in some cases, you might only be 90, percent there, but I think it's a risk-based approach that organizations need to take because it's untenable to manage stovepipes of frameworks and obligations. Now, if you are an organization that has more, support and boots on the ground locally that are going to be accountable for, creating the governance materials and enforcing those in the organization, you basically have that leverage support. Then maybe you can start to create some exception cases. But what I would think we usually find is that the former most often, and the most practical way to proceed is taking that harmonized approach.
All right. Well, it's a good question. Let's keep moving. All right. So speaking of operating models, right? This is where the rubber meets the road. Why don't you guys walk through maybe the sort of the big picture of this, and then maybe an area or two that is sort of key that maybe trips practitioners up a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. We know there's a lot going on with this slide. What we hope is, these types of presentations where you all receive these slides, that this is something that is very, actionable and referenceable for your programs. We're kind of working backwards here, right? Like we've said, as soon as those, top-down approaches are done, they're stale. They need to be refreshed. We need to have privacy by design. We need to have some bottoms-up automated machine scanning in place. So how does that all tie together in the future? And then later we'll talk about how we build to this. So the top left there really is just meant to show privacy by design, right? Prior to a new asset or process coming online, we need to conduct some assessment. What third parties might we be engaging? Is there personal information? Does it rise to a DPIA or PIA that needs to be conducted? So security reviewing it. Again, is this a new vendor or a new international data transfer? All of that information we want to ideally gather before something goes into production. Once it does go online, especially from your assets in your stores, that's where, and welcome Joe to chime in on some of this. We want to get it into that process of data governance, having review and controls put in place where we can okay, in the onboarding we said there's going to be no social security number included in here. So in our periodic scans, like, do we get alerted if that pattern starts to appear? That's incredibly valuable. Also from shadow IT, do we start to have applications that are dumping unknown data somewhere? So is that triggering us that a new asset might have come online we weren't aware of, and we need to get that back through our process? So again, this is kind of a good iterative control cycle for how we introduce privacy by design, vendor risk management, and good data governance in an ongoing manner.
Yeah, and maybe we should hit one of the questions we've got, because there's a lot here certainly to digest. Dirk asked the question, should your data inventory not actually be part of your business process mapping and maintenance so that no system change is not reflected in the register? So to that extent, you guys follow that question on from Dirk, and how would that work with sort of this kind of workflow?
So this is Joe. I think we certainly don't lead with that, because a lot of clients don't have the maturity around business process to do that, right? Actually, their business process understanding is even less mature than their data, the understanding of their data maturity, right, and their data assets. But to the point earlier, where if you've got these different efforts going on, absolutely, coordinate them and leverage the collective. If you've got a client, and in the past when I've had clients where they've got a robust business engineering function, right, where they've got a Lean Six Sigma, or even just business analysts who are mapping processes, helping the business improve them, stack ranking them, and having a backlog of business processes to be re-engineered each year and improved. Absolutely leverage that because one of the most valuable parts of those or the most valuable layers of a business process map is what data is being managed, feeds into each step of the process, is created or managed in the process, and is outputted of the process. And having that layer in with the business process map is absolutely, not only makes the business process mapping more valuable, but allows us to be leveraged as part of data mapping, data inventory, right, in a way that leverages that collective and makes sure you don't have to duplicate work. But if the client isn't already doing that kind of business process work, it's really challenging to introduce this because it's a whole other discipline that they may or may not have.
Yeah, it's a little bit of the crawl, walk, run approach to this, right? You can't boil the ocean and try to do too many things at once. And deciding what's foundational in your maturity model is probably the most important in terms of how you get started.
Yeah, it's like on this model here, like if you have an enterprise architecture function, right, in technology that's really good, like doing reviews, architectural reviews, and making sure that any updates or any new systems are going through this really rigor around all these different requirements. Great, this can kind of tie into it, but you wouldn't want to say before we can do this, you need to build out an enterprise architecture function because we never get to the data inventory. So I think of it as being similar.
Yeah, I think it goes to show you we've got a bunch of responsible parties and a bunch of complementary technologies here. There's everything from file analytics to IAM to DLP to various things that are going to play into this. Because you're talking about the organization's entire data universe and how information flows around. So it's obviously it's going to be a complex undertaking, but you got to get started. And it certainly our big takeaway today is that mapping and the inventory process has to be at the forefront. Let's move to next as we kind of start wrapping up, and want to make sure we'll have ability to cover off questions at the end. So where would you sort of advise folks to focus here? Which are going to maybe be some of the harder areas? Is it the scoping and the beginning out, making sure you've got the right framework? Is it scanning where you're actually rubber meets the road? Where would you say? I mean, all these are important to various degrees, but from a takeaway perspective for the audience, what would you hone in on here?
Yeah, I'll start with kind of the identify one here, and then I'd like to draw in Joe certainly to talk about kind of scanning and everything to the right of that. But this is basically a very high level project plan, right? Like where do we start? How do we create a data inventory if we don't have one today? So that identify the first thing, scope, right? Like what do we want to solve with our inventory? We want to comply with Article 30 of GDPR, right? Okay, so seven elements or something that we need to collect. All right, we also want to make sure that we identify where we might have third parties that are receiving information in a third country or have international data transfers. Okay, add 3 additional questions for that. Are we complying with our records retention schedule? Let's add 2 additional questions to check in on that, right? So those different buttons we saw early on, which ones do you need to solve right now? Great, obviously, if we can solve all, but we recognize there's a balance between how frictional it is to build that up the first time versus the value that you derive from that. So first, let's create that attribute framework, and then doing some of those. If again we say we don't have any existing list of what are those critical common data stores or any context on why information sits in them, is used in them, we probably do need to conduct some custodial interviews and just get those cards on the table so that we've started to discover some of those processes, some of those assets, and then going into a pilot phase. So before we just launch 100 or 200 or thousands of surveys or start just connecting and scanning, let's do a few pilots, sit down with some subject matter experts, understand what are the critical ways that they use those assets, the critical processes they're trying to deliver, and then from that tweak our attributes and questionnaires. Maybe we quickly realize, okay, everyone's going to tell us that they're not complying with the data retention period, so let's not even ask that anymore, right? But we do, realize that we've got, a lot more vendors that we didn't know about. The business has been engaging directly, so we want to ask a few more questions about vendors. So using those pilots to start to drive some of that out. And then Joe,
yeah,
we kind of get that point.
I just want to push on the pilot because we have customers who will approach it different ways. Some will try to do it holistically. Others will look at geographic sort of business units, business regions, or separately business units. Do you have a preference? Does it matter? Or is it more just sort of getting the size right?
I think at that point you start to identify what your risk. To give you the consulting response, right? Like, to say it depends on geography or business unit, just based on how you're structured. I do kind of like to start, oftentimes with some of those higher risk business units. Personally, just in my experience, but again, kind of depends on if you're a very centralized or decentralized organization, or if you've been built through M&A. But I do find a lot of value in that. Starting with the marketing functions or the HR functions that may have a lot of this sensitive information. But what I've kind of talked about is that top-down approach, and I think in parallel with that, right? Like through this, like we should know, everyone's dumping stuff on the their own version of the H drive or box, and that's just the Wild West. So you discover very quickly what that good scanning pilot candidate is. And Joe, I'm wondering if I could ask you to kind of pick up from there and talk about some thoughts.
Oh yeah, for sure. And we've got a slide later on that is similar to the one you showed before. It's an operating model for actually going through and cleaning up content. But the scan, we've been hearing for years that the technology is going to be here, right? It's going to be Watson is going to show up and not only win Jeopardy, but clean up your share drives. And it hasn't really been the case until recently. And even now, ActiveNav is one of these solutions that I've had the pleasure of working with for a long time. But it isn't so much this magical artificial intelligence, natural language processing. I'm just going to sort of point at the share drive and it'll learn and tell me all the invoices I have and all this kind of thing. I mean, one day we'll get there, right? But until we reach singularity, it's really about very practical, almost more MacGyver, roll up your sleeves kind of blue collar approach, where it's like, where's all the stale stuff I can just kind of move out of the equation? Where's all the junk file types I can get out of here, right? This is not like complicated, but it's breaking down a complex problem. And I think probably the most difficult thing, and Brian, you alluded to it with the complexity of the organization, is that a share drive isn't one thing. It's dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of things, servers all over, different data centers all over the world. Where's HR data? Where's this? Where's that? And so, being able to take really rock solid tools that are available and point them in a targeted way at content, and taking a stepwise approach. Because if a client has 500, an organization has 500 terabytes, a petabyte, multiple petabytes, this is not just like scan it and come back after a cup of coffee and see what it told you, right? This is like weeks and weeks and months and months. This is like the inventory, right? The scanning is very much an ongoing. It's not a set it and forget it. It's a program. And so figuring out how to start tackling it and put it in an incremental, meaningful, stepwise fashion that lets you tackle this data problem, right? That frankly has been what we've been getting in this mess for 20 or 25 years. We're not going to get out of it in a quarter. And so figuring out a way, just like with the top-down inventory, with the bottom up to create an approach that's going to be incremental, that is quarter over quarter, shows progress, yes, but is honest about the fact that it's going to take us a little longer to get out of this mess. So, but don't let that stop you from getting started, right?
Yeah, and just on that kind of topic, Joe, we got a good question from Jenny, and she asked, who do you see as the owner for the data inventory? The product owners of the DP team. What is your experience of who owns this and continually tends to the updates? And maybe that's a little bit of where some of the technology comes in, right? You don't want to have you want the updating and the evergreen nature of your mapping solution be as automated as possible. But what are your thoughts on sort of ownership and the care and feeding of this initiative?
I think I might echo Brian and fall back on being a consultant and say it depends, right? Because we talked earlier about there's multiple stakeholders who care about the data inventory. Let's say privacy is leading it, right? Privacy may be involved, IT may be involved, cyber may be involved, legal, records, right? And so any one of those could be a perfectly fine and successful owner of the data inventory, as long as the other folks who have a stake in it are part of the process of maintaining it. And so for me, I've been less concerned with my clients about who should own it. Saying like there's one right person and every organization should have that function own it, and saying more like take a look at the organization, who has the clout, who has the passion, who has the resources behind them, who's positioned to best care and feed for this, and then just help them make sure they take account of the other groups that have to be involved in the care and feeding, rather than saying it has to be privacy. Well, but privacy reports up to facilities and has no clout. Well, then this thing's going to die in the vine where somebody else maybe should have owned it.
Yeah, and I'll add there that I often see, privacy was handed this because we need to comply with Article 30, or we're doing a CCPA project. But that target operating model, back to that, is, that's meant to show the distribution of labor in maintaining this. To be pressed on an answer, if an organization has a built out and mature standalone data governance function, I think that's a great place for this to live. So when we work in financial services and those functions are built out, we often see it falling there, if not kind of longer term. Because of the risk, oftentimes security is someone who kind of picks up the governance on it. Again, knowing that there are many other groups that need to provide input and keep this, as you said, kind of cared for and fed over time.
Yeah, great. Thanks. That was a good question. And let's move to next. I think we're starting to get into the finishing stretches. And next slide. We can talk about that one, but okay. Here's that operating model again. Bit of an eye chart. Where again the ownership of this and when you start, how you start, etc. Are all important issues. What points would you list out for the attendees?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is if you look at the 4 diamonds that are on top of each other, right? So review the scan results. And then essentially what this is just a fancy pants way of showing a decision tree, right? Which is, well, first of all, and everyone wants to jump to, well, how am I going to find this one contract? Well, hold on. I don't know. But I'll tell you what I do know, which is that it's really easy to find junk data, right? And there's not a universal definition for any of these. And so I guess the important precursor is, as an organization, you have to decide what the definitions of these are and have policies and procedures that are going to drive this. But once you do, right, junk data, there's 100 or so file types that are commonly thought to be junk and have no business value. Okay, great. So let's start with that. How much of our share drive, let's say, is junk? Great. Put that to the side, right? Let's get that out of the picture. Now, if this one says purge here, this operating model, it could also be boxcard. Take it out of tier 1 storage or available storage, put it in an archive somewhere until we can have legal deal with it, right? We don't have to delete it. That's our fear, that we're afraid to push the delete button. Then just take it out of circulation. And then next, have we found any, is there another category is stale data, right? So have we found any data that hasn't been looked at in X amount of time? Again, we're not going to necessarily delete, right? At that point, as you can see from this bottom triangle, okay, we haven't looked at it, and let's call it 3 years. No one's accessed it. Okay, well, is it on legal hold? Well, if it is, then it needs to go in the legal hold process. Perfect. We can pass it off to our corporate law legal friends. And if it isn't on legal hold, well, is it a record that needs to be retained? If it is, it's got to go into the records management workflow. And if it isn't, it can go away. Because if we don't have a legal reason or a policy reason for keeping it, let's get rid of it. So what it's meant to show here, and there's one for sensitive data, right? There's one for network credentials. But as an organization, the way you build this out is you say, starting from some basic categories like junk, stale, sensitive could be broken down more. You can build a pretty, although it looks like an eye chart, when you start to get into the logic of it, it's actually a pretty clear decision tree, because the goal here is not to be perfect. The goal is not to ask individuals to decide every time we're going to get rid of a document whether they should or shouldn't. It's to come up with the principles that are going to govern it, the operating model, have that supported with policy, with leadership buy-in, with procedures, supported with technology, and just execute. We turn the crank. And so that way, if we have a regulatory action, if we have a lawsuit, litigation, we can't say that we're perfect, but we can say that we have a policy and we follow it in a way that we try to take out human decision-making, capriciousness, chance, bad actors, as much as we can. And if you have a problem with this, please give us feedback. We will tweak it, we'll update it, and we'll continue to evolve this and iterate it. The goal here is not to ask end users to have a cleanup day once a year, because that's just not going to work. It needs to be something more structured like this that will stand up and be seen as reasonable and repeatable and audible and so on in a court of law, regulator, and so on.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff in there, Joe. And I think I contrast a little bit of your comments with e-discovery, right? E-discovery is everyone's really worried about an individual document. and it's kind of this process kind of with the scalpel, and that may be appropriate for that case, but we find clients that they want to operate this at scale. And by scale, it means you can't have individuals like, let's look at every document that we thought was junk, right? Just you've obviated the goal of getting rid of redundant, obsolete, trivial data. And we know we've got tools to go out there and do it quickly. And it's not going to be perfect, but it doesn't need to be perfect. I think that's another big takeaway for this, is that this isn't e-discovery 10 or 15 years ago where everyone was worried about losing a file because they might get sanctioned. In the land of governance, you want to be good and not capricious, and have well thought out rules. But no one's looking for a standard of perfection here. And so, I think there's a lot of good stuff in your comment. And one more I'd just quickly add was one of the things we found with Equifax in our work is transitory files. So files that somehow got kind of lost in their way from point A to point Z, and they just got stuck somewhere. And those are the files that are also sensitive. So it's like it's okay that they had a sensitive file. It's not okay that the sensitive file got sort of stuck in some purgatory. And that's where they got into a lot of trouble. So once you have these rules, the remediation of them becomes just a process that you run with maybe your attorneys, maybe with your consultants, maybe internally. But then to your point, I like to turn the crank. Once you've got it, you just kind of keep turning the crank and making progress.
And Dean, what I love about these solutions and these initiatives here is that they're very measurable in risk and compliance. I think a struggle that a lot of practitioners have is demonstrating the value add, right? Like we write these privacy policies or procedures, and sometimes it's difficult to show, outside of just, this many individuals took training, right? The value, the protection that we're providing the organization going through this process, you start to quantify and start with a pilot, and then it's scalable. Hey, we had X terabytes or this number of files. Look, we've shrunk it to this. That's measurable protection that we're providing the organization. And I absolutely agree. In litigation, you're thinking about that silver bullet that's going to kill us, spoliation or that one document. In regulatory compliance and regulator investigations or audits, it's all about defensibility and a risk-based approach, right? And this is beautiful for that, and that we can start to quantify something that I think is often a little sticky, little subjective. So I love that. Yeah,
and the thing we're developing in our newest data mapping solution is a health score. And to your point, you should have a health score. Let's say you're green, yellow, red. We use amber for our European guests. But if it's in the yellow zone and you take substantive steps to remediate it, it should move to green. Maybe not immediately, but over time you should see that progress. And I think that's where we need to get to in this sort of regulatory world, is be thinking about your data holistically, and then thinking about making meaningful improvements that you can show to your stakeholders and executives and anybody regulators who wants to look at your system and say, look, we're not perfect, but we understand our data universe, and we're making demonstrable gains over time. I think that's about as good as you can ask for in this world, particularly with all the regimes that are out there. Well, maybe let's do this because we want to make sure we get to questions here. Neve, I think we were pretty close to takeaways. Maybe why don't you guys pick one of these each, and then we'll jump into questions. Jason, we haven't heard from you in a little bit. Do you want to jump into one takeaway, or you're not restricted to this list, but the list is there if you want to use it?
Absolutely. Thanks for throwing that out there. I think number 5, I've harped on, relentlessly, but there's going to be commonalities across all the laws. Don't let one drive your program. There are commonalities. You need to know what you have first, and don't put the cart before the horse. So I'll keep it short and sweet and kick it back to you all.
All right, Joe, you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll take the easy one, and then Brian will be upset with me. You can't restrict and manage what you don't know you have. I mean, that's just to me, that's always been the baseline. And because I think, if you think about financial assets as opposed to information assets. If we tried to manage our finances at a corporation, then we manage our information, it'd be crazy. Like, I don't really know how much money we have or where it is or how many invoices we pay or whatever. We just kind of do it, right? You never would, but we do that with our information all the time, and it's equally as important. So I think one is absolutely the foundation for everything else.
Yeah, and I'll say number two, define what's in scope. At the start of these, bring infosec, privacy, legal, compliance, governance, those functions together, and establish those attributes and that governance structure and that future state operating model, so that you can build and deploy something that's evergreen.
All right, cool. Let's take a look at a couple questions. Some of them are quite bodacious, so I've got to get to one. We've got one from Julie. This is more a comment. Be interested in the panel's take on it. She says information asset registers are better managed by IG functions on behalf of the business. This can ensure that security, ISO, and GDPR can be aligned. It sounds like a good perspective, but again, maybe it depends on the organization and structure perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you're mature where you have that IG function built out, that's a great place for it to live, because it's kind of the glue across everything. So some organizations may not have that fully baked. So it's more of a borrow. But if you have that function and built out in your organization, I think that's a great place for it to be managed with input from other groups.
All right, we've got one more. Maybe we can get to this one and one more if we got time. So a question about stale data and legacy systems forgotten by IT, and being able to, the question is, does anyone have anything to say about locating these systems and dealing with them? I think stale is relatively easy from my perspective. What do you guys think? I mean, compared to some of the more nuanced ones, staleness and lack of access and some of those other things.
Dean, I feel like the only wrench in that, I think there's two. One, like, one person's stale is another person's fresh. Like, a lot of times something that hasn't been touched in 3 years is stale, but you look at like land group, that easement from 20 years ago, if you got rid of it because it hadn't been touched, you're cooked if like some landowner says that you can't have like a pipeline running, right, or something like that. I think the second hard one is like if network folks didn't do their job right and they overrode that metadata around date created, date last accessed, date modified, and you'll tell right away because everything's March 26th, 2014 is when it was created, then you're cooked, right? It can be hard. But assuming that, your folks who are on the network side know what they're doing, and that you can have conversations with the business about what really means stale for you, and then you have a tool like ActiveNav where you can see like when the access drops off, it's an absolutely the first place you start. It's quite easy to figure that out. Now, the stale systems and the server under someone's desk that no one knows about is a little bit harder, and there isn't really a great answer to that. That's where like that top-down approach that Brian was talking about, asking people where stuff is, can help you discover some of that, right?
Yeah, now we've actually seen a few clients that'll look at mapping stale with employees that have left the business. So if the employee who owned that file is no longer with the business, it's not a legal hold, and it hasn't been touched, you can start to layer a few of those things in, and make some pretty easy, hopefully, decisions for your data management. We're right about on time. We've got more questions. Sorry, we did not get to all of them today, but a few of them are chunky, and I want to get us started and then run over. Really wanted to thank the panel today. So Jason, Brian, and Joe, really appreciate your insights today, and for the audience attending, hopefully you found it useful, and we'll send follow-up for people who want some of the content thereafter. So thanks everybody, and have a good afternoon and evening.